Joining us is a man who is no stranger to the Observer. Let me say a pleasant good evening to criminologist Dr. Randy Seepersad. Welcome once again, Dr. Seepersad.
Thank you. Absolutely a pleasure to be here with you.
Okay. You know, I'm looking at some information here. According to the Education Minister, Dr. Nyan Gatsby Dolly, between 2015 and 2019, of the 510 people charged with murder, 62% of them were between the ages of 15 and 29, and 96% of them were male. And of course, bringing it up closer to 2022, 54% of all violent crime, including murder, is being committed by youths between the ages of 15 and 29. This is the reality. And we hear so much about this, Dr. Seepersad, as far as the behavioral patterns and what have you. But what drives these young men as far as the connection between the teen violence and where it evolves to the point of gang violence?
Right, so that's a very good question. And that observation about the age range most heavily involved in crime is something that we see across the world. Where younger persons are more likely to be engaged. Very young persons may become engaged as they get a bit older into, young adulthood. The levels of engagement increase, but as people get older, let's say beyond the 30 years of age, then engagement starts to decrease again. And that is actually something called the age crime curve, and it has to do with several things. One of the things is that within that age range, persons are now trying to find their bearing in terms of employment, in terms of who they are, their sense of self, personality development, establishing themselves, upward social mobility, and all of that. And you will find that in any given society, a certain proportion of persons will experience challenges in achieving the types of things that the society expects of them via legitimate means, and therefore many of them, unfortunately, would gravitate towards illegitimate means. Now, the flip side of it is that if the conditions in the society are such that, a very large proportion of persons experience difficulties in achieving upward social mobility or all of the trappings of success, what it means, unfortunately, is that it widens the net for youth engagement in crime. And I'm really, really glad that you asked that question, because there are a couple changes that we are seeing happening in Trinidad and Tobago when we look at the crime data. And two of the most alarming changes are, one, the age demographic is getting a bit younger in terms of crime engagement, but at the same time, the net is widening in terms of the proportion of persons, especially the proportion of young persons who are engaged in crime. So if I draw from CAPA's statistics, that is the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service crime statistics, even if you look up to 2020, 2021, what you would see is youths, and I'm defining youths here now as persons under 18 years of age, so not adults, would have been engaged in 1.5 to 2% of all serious crimes. And if you look at even individual serious crimes, whether you look at murders or robberies or what have you, sexual offenses, etc., you'd see that the percentage hovers around 1.5 to 2%.
Right.
Now, what we happen to see occurring recently is that the proportion of youths engaged in crime is increasing. So the percentage that are attributed to young persons under 18 years of age happens to be increasing, and dramatically so, within the last 2 to 3 years. Now, this is something that is troubling, but at the same time, probably not very surprising. And the reason that I say not very surprising is that when you look at what the younger generation, especially the Gen Z youths, are exposed to, you realize that something different is happening. They have been exposed to fragmented political views. They have been exposed to institutional failures, failure in terms of community support, family support, educational failure. They've been exposed to unprecedented levels of violence through social media, which creates a possibility of desensitization and social learning. They've been exposed to unprecedented levels of gang violence, and not only that, gangs sharing their messages and their music and culture and all of that through social media, where every youth in the country can now access these kinds of things. And so you're talking about youths many times who are, some of them rudderless, in the sense that they don't have a sense of direction. They're looking for role models.
And we understand all that, Dr. Seepersad. And what do you say to folks who would weigh in and make the statement, listen, all of that is good and well, but once I am approached by any of these young men who are not hesitant to snuff out my life, I don't have time to play psychologist with them. I don't have time to find out whether they come from a fragmented background, whether they come from a fatherless, whatever the case may be. I may sympathize perhaps looking from the outside, but once they're there, once they're deemed to be a menace, once they're labeled a monster, most individuals don't have time to try to connect the dots, especially when it is that we are under siege as a society by people who, again, are not going to think twice about jumping your wall, coming, taking your belongings, and, hey, just even for the fun of it, will snuff you out. I mean, so how do we bridge that so people could understand?
Right. So no, I'm not saying that people don't have a right to defend themselves. If that's where you're going with the line of argument, you're totally right.
Not a matter of defend, but too many times we've had this conversation, and it always seems to be a sense of we know where this thing may stem from, because at the end of the day, we are all a product of our environment, and that's a fact. But the fact of the matter also puts out that we can no longer just accept these things and go about it as business as usual. These are young men, and according to one commissioner of police who's no longer there, he made it quite clear it is a different sort of a criminal or criminal-minded individual that has never been seen or shown its face before in Trinidad and Tobago. And those of us who are under siege are not going to take the time out to try to connect the dots. We want something done, and we want something done now.
And I'm really glad that you made the point, because you're totally right. The reasons and the drivers on all of that, this is something that we know and we understand, and the dynamic is changing, and we are also aware that it is changing. So, and I'm really glad that you made the point, because what it suggests is that the shortfall is not in the area of knowing what the problems are, not even knowing what needs to be done, because we have a very clear idea of what needs to be done, but the shortfall is in the action taken or the action not taken. And I would say that any political party which has power in a country should have the resources, or at least has the responsibility to take that kind of action, not only to go down the same road that we have been going, which is the suppressive side of it. I'm not saying that's not necessary. It is absolutely necessary. The courts, the prisons, the corrections, that is necessary. But we have been using that approach, the suppressive approach, ad nauseum, and we see the results. It means that we have to start to take action outside of that area that we're so comfortable within. Right? And I'm really glad that you raised the point.
And that's my point, Dr. Seepersad. At some point in time, these indicators would go up, these red flags will go up. And do we have a method, do we have a system to identify? I'm talking about the fact that from Mommy Nice Child to a menace, from Mommy Nice Boy to a monster. And that is how things are playing out currently in our society. Now, some of the things, for example, attention deficit, hyperactivity, conduct disorder, or other behavioral disorders. Now, and you're right, times have changed. Of course, we no longer, apply this whole ideology of taking a village to raise a child, because the village itself is fragmented. And that support system, that where mommy can go to work, granny will pick up the slack, auntie is there, that sort of domestic network is no longer there, that safety net. Now we have to face the reality that we have today. At some point in time, somebody has to recognize that there's something going on here, and we need to nip it in the bud before it gets out of hand. Before Billy reaches the point where he decides to pull a gun because he feels no sense of belonging, no sense of hope, no sense of being, what the case may be, how do we catch him from Mommy Nice Boy to making that dire decision?
Right. That question is spot on. And the approach that is being used is an approach that is based on risk assessment. And what you're really getting at in the language of criminology is what is called secondary level intervention or secondary level prevention. So the thing about it is you want to be able to catch youths before they reach the point, and meaning youths who are at risk. You want to find out who are the at-risk youths, but catch them before they reach the point of actually engaging in crime. And there are risk assessment instruments that have been developed for that purpose. In fact, just the other day, some colleagues from Arizona State University developed some instruments for St. Lucia, Grenada, and St. Kitts and Nevis, where something called the YREAD Youth Resilience, Inclusion, and Empowerment Program, which is a USAID-funded program, 5-year intervention to reduce crime and violence. They design custom-built instruments that would be applied in a community setting to identify the youths most at risk of engaging in violence. And once you identify them using these scientific means, then you're able to provide intervention services via the YRE program to reduce the risk that such a youth would engage in crime. Now, this is a proactive, this is a preventative type of approach, but I hasten to say that despite all of the successes of these approaches, the sad thing in the Caribbean, and indeed for us in Trinidad and Tobago, is that we only see these kinds of data-driven approaches happening when somebody external comes in and puts the money and does it. Somebody has to come into our country, like USAID, for instance, and do it. Because despite the fact that we know that these things exist, and we know how to utilize these things, and we know how to do the secondary interventions, for some reason, these things don't seem to get traction at all, right? And the U.S. government, for instance, has put $30 million into the YRE project, and it's going very well. It's getting some very good results. And these are the kinds of engagements that we need to do, but we just simply don't do it.
Yeah, and again, you know, not taken away from that, you said, is that St. Vincent and the Grenadines?
It's St. Kitts, Nevis, St. Lucia, and Grenada.
All right, because quite recently, the Prime Minister Gonzalez of St. Vincent and the Grenadines made it quite clear, you know, he has no problem with the hangman. And he believes that this must be adopted across the region, where a handful of citizens should not have the rest of us at the mercy or holding us to ransom. So, I mean, while we're trying to figure out these indicators and to act on them, there are people who are advocating in the midst of that, listen, our patience is running thin, our patience is running out. We want to be able to come outside again, not to be hassled. I mean, you have senior citizens, and I keep bringing up this point, who are simply prisoners in their own home. They're afraid to come out and do any sort of errands because they are the most vulnerable as well, walking around easy to take advantage of. So while we're talking of this, and some of these other behaviors is early involvement with alcohol, drugs, and tobacco. Now, if you're coming from a single home, you know, that single parent may not have time to actually throw an eye to find out what this child is doing. They're concerned about when the school hours are there, you go to school, I have my job to do, you pull your weight, you pull yours. I don't need to know too much about involvement with you. I'm not coming to any parent-teachers meeting with you. This is the reality that we face in many sectors. Also, low intelligence and educational achievement. Why is it that we are dragging some of these students through the system, knowing quite well that they may not be academically inclined, but of course preparing them for something else that they can compete on the global market? Why do we feel it necessary just to make up numbers instead of making up citizens who are going to be productive rather than pull a gun at any time they feel frustrated? Why?
And I'm really glad that you raised that point, you know, and that's a really salient issue. I've heard it said that our education systems in the Caribbean are systems that are designed to ensure that students fail. No, I'm not knocking the education system. I'm saying that the concept of the way that it works is flawed in the sense that it puts everybody through the same mold. right? It doesn't cater to the level of diversity that we have in terms of learning abilities, learning styles, and all of these kinds of things that we need to. And it doesn't cater to the fact that not every child needs to be doing physics and chemistry and biology, or even wants to be doing physics and chemistry and biology. If we put everybody through the same mold, what it does is it creates a workforce that is a very non-diverse workforce, in the sense that they all have similar levels of knowledge and skills, and then they cannot move into an economy, if there is an economy that is diversified and requires a diverse set of skills, right? But the point being that you made, and I think rightly so, many kids are going to go through that system. We're going to get the numbers, yes. Many of them are going to fail, and then there's no safety net educational to catch them. And that is a recipe for disaster. That is something we've known for a long while, and we definitely need to start to think about, could we diversify the educational system to cater to a wider range of skills and knowledge? And of course, what would that translate to in the long run? It would translate into practical things, into a workforce that has a greater diversity of skills that will help to diversify the economy and the earning capacity of the economy in the country. And of course, absorb a more diverse workforce.
And I agree with you. And this is going to take a lot of work, because we're talking about, a cultural sort of a thing that we have where every year with the C exam, and you have people saying that, they pass for first choice or whatever the case may be. But what happens to those students who are not destined to be part of that whole academia, arena, and have the ability and have the skills? And I think the problem here is that we don't sell the people who have made it globally. For example, the creator of the Wendy's burger franchise, he didn't get his GED, which is equivalent to a high school diploma, until in his 50s. And there are many stories like that. But why are these stories not shared? Why does it seem to be one-dimensional, that this is the system, you have to go through the system, if you don't meet the standards, you have failed, you're not a good individual, you simply should just give up? And what kind of message are we sending? Because sooner or later, we'll have to face the fact that many of these schools are simply not turning out the people who are academically inclined, but is becoming a factory for criminals, manufacturing minds who feel that there's no sense of belonging, and the only way that they're going to be relevant is to go out there and be involved in criminal activity.
Right, and compounding that is the whole issue of stigmatization, labeling, stereotyping, because you label these youths, many of them from very, very early, as failures, if you want to use that word. I don't like that particular word, but
neither do I. You're right.
Because the system doesn't cater to the diversity of skills and knowledge and abilities and all that. So if you fail at this one particular type of set of tests or skills that are required, then what happens? You set up a whole trajectory where a child is disenfranchised, and you create a sense of low self-esteem, low self-worth. The society sees them in a particular way. Worst of all, they see themselves in a particular way. And as human beings, we do have a need to experience success. And I use the word success in quotes, because there are different ways to experience success. You could be holding a gun and rob somebody, and that to you is a sense of success. That is a sense of achievement.
Yeah.
And it could be a sense of achievement in certain social circles, for instance, in gang, right? So we have to consider, when we take away avenues, legitimate avenues, or we restrict legitimate avenues for experiencing success, people, especially younger persons, will find other avenues, some of them illegitimate avenues, for experiencing success. And it's an unfortunate byproduct of an educational system which really forces everybody to fit into the same mold. And I think that
you're right about that. You're right. And it's time that we start looking at these things differently. You know, one of the things that really and truly stands out for me, Dr. Seepersad, is that we know all the reasons why individuals would gravitate to gangs, and we know that they're in the gangs and they're functioning in the gangs. But we are yet to hear of a program that gets them out of these gangs. And is it something based on our structure of our society that it cannot be a reality, something to exist? Because you may have to move out of the environment, you will have to cut ties with certain people. You know, trouble is always easy to get into and the hardest thing to get out of. But there's no programs highlighting folks who want to make that change and come out of criminal activity.
Right now, while we may not have any programs happening on the ground that do that, there are programs internationally which do that. And there is one that has been tried, it's the Cure Violence model, which creates peace, or if you want to use that word peace, it creates a level of calm in communities with gangs by mediating and calming down situations when they arise, and I'm talking about situations which could result in violence and especially inter-gang back and forth rivalries. But part of that model entails using what I call outreach workers, who are case workers, who identify persons who are at highest levels of risk of violence, both perpetrators and victims, in the communities, and they provide services to help them get out of gangs. But of course, that's much easier said than done.
Yeah.
Because sometimes to get out of a gang will cost you your life. You join a gang, that's
exactly
membership for life.
Exactly, and I think that this has to work in, you know, together, amalgamated. People like yourself and others who are stakeholders, in this sort of arrangement. Because yeah, you're right. Coming out of it could cost you your life. And compounded with the fact that you have people who are benefiting from all the actions that we've spoke about. There's always going to be somebody benefiting, because none of these young men own the boats that are carrying the illicit product. None of them have the airplanes. None of them have the package resources, because let's be honest here, a lot of narcotics is also involved. And I think that those people who are pulling the strings don't want to see their labor force interfered with, as far as having people turning over a new leaf and saying, I no longer want to be a part of this business, because you are going to be cutting into somebody's profit. And we have to look at it for what it really is. So getting in is easy. We know all the reasons. We have all the legislation as far as when it comes to gang violence and all of that. But how do we get them to turn as far as saying this life is a dead end?
Well, you know, the thing is, and it's ironic, is that for some people and for a lot of people, what really makes it much more difficult is, despite the short lifespan that gang members may have, despite the risks, many of them don't actually want to leave the gang. For them, that is their way of life. For many of them, it's a simple matter of protection. If you look at what is happening in the communities, some of them, if you don't belong to a particular gang, you could easily become victim of some kind of gang violence. So the simple fact of belonging to a gang provides a sense of protection and security for you. So it's really a very complex situation that is compounded by a lot of factors, you know, that really make it very, very difficult for persons to leave gangs. So, you know, one of the suggestions in that regard is that you try to prevent them from joining gangs in the first place. And research in the Caribbean will show you, and I will give you an example here. Research in the Caribbean will show you that even youths in secondary schools are now joining gangs. And there are programs that we could put in secondary schools that are already fully developed. An example is the Gang Resistance and Education and Training Program, or what is known as the GREAT Program. That is something that would not cost any government a lot of money to bring the curriculum for the GREAT Program, modify it to suit our local context, and put it in the schools, right? Because the youths in the schools could very well be, and indeed are, the next generation of gang members. As I said, the net is widening in terms of those. It's not just youths in dispossessed communities anymore.
And that's where it gets scary, Dr. Seepersad, when we start talking about the fact that, you know, the youths that are wherever at that stage, is the future gang members. We're no longer talking about they are the future leaders, the future business leaders, nothing like that. And even going back to that whole system, that educational system, I don't know why it is we attach this stigma of failure. You fail. Yeah, failed at what? I mean, none of these exams are universal. I mean, if Harry lives in an area where he's never seen a swimming pool, he's not going to know exactly how to relate to anything when it comes to that discussion, and vice versa. So none of these things are universal except mathematics. But at the same time, we are now coming to a point where we're saying, listen, if so many youngsters are listed this year, we expect 18 or perhaps a lower percentage to be collateral damage. And that's where it's scary. That's where it's really scary. We start writing off the future.
No, we cannot, and we cannot afford to do that.
No,
not even one person could afford to be collateral damage, because that one person could be the one person who comes and shoots you or your child or your mother or your father.
So
you
true.
Understand?
And I just hope that the conversation changes. People like yourself who are really trying to bring out the information, but like I said, it's going to take a lot. We are so deep into this culture right now that the only thing that we seem to be interested in is what's at our doorstep. And if it doesn't land on our doorstep, then unfortunately it's not our concern. But we have seen what crime has done to this country. We've seen the domino effect. We've seen what it can do to the economy. And yet still many people are turning a blind eye to that which is right before them.
And that's unfortunate, because what is not on your doorstep, it doesn't mean it wouldn't eventually reach on your doorstep.
You're right about that.
That's the problem. That's the problem.
Dr. Seepersad, I want to thank you so much for taking time out this evening. It's always a pleasure. We need to continue this conversation. I will reach out to you. Best of luck to you and the entire team. But the conversation needs to change. The narrative needs to change. And the way we deal with this, our thinking really and truly needs to change. We can't have all the reasons why we know, but yet still we implement nothing to deal with those factors that we already know are taking place. That's totally unfair. We need to save these youngsters.
Thank you very much. Absolutely always a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you, sir.